Hey everybody, this is John for MTGo coming at you with another deck overview, this time one of the more unique creations in the modern format. If you like these informative deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and don't forget to check out some of our other deck overview guides on the channel. So, Enchantress is a deck that is a legacy port in the modern format. It is a prison-based deck that tries to use enchantment-based components to lock your opponent out of the game. To enable this, it uses things like Enchantress's Presence and Sithis Harvest Hand whenever you cast an enchantment spell to draw a card. Basically, the vast majority of the deck is either lands or enchantments, turning this into an engine to power the rest of the deck. Beyond that, you have things like Abundant Growth and Utopia Sprawl to either accelerate or fix your mana to be able to cast your spells. And then you use things like Sterling Grove to find your various missing pieces to whatever you're looking for. Sanctum Weaver is a way to get ahead on mana. While it is a bit fragile, it is an enchantment, plays into the strategy, and helps with your plan of trying to snowball card advantage from your Enchantress's Presence and Sithis. Destiny Spinner is a way to fight through counter spells. If it resolves, creatures and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. And then there's also a win con in the late game when you can turn your lands into large tramplers. Beyond that, you are using primarily the card Blood Moon and Solitary Confinement to fight what your opponent's doing. Blood Moon, obviously, while you are primarily a green and white base deck, you can easily find a Mountain or Utopia Sprawl on red, cast a Blood Moon, slow your opponent down in that regard, slowing their development. But the real prize of the card is Solitary Confinement. Solitary Confinement is basically a card that makes you immune to combat damage, or really damage in general. Beginning skip your draw step, you have Shroud, which means you cannot be targeted by discard spells, burn spells, etc. And prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. Now this has two notable drawbacks. One, doesn't prevent life loss, so if you have some random way to cause your opponent to lose life, you can get around that. Not a huge deal. And the other one is, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Solitary Confinement unless you discard a card. So you have a situation where you're not allowed to have a draw step, and you have to pitch a card to keep it in play. Now you could, let it down for a little bit, maybe cast another copy, but this is where the Enchantress's Presence, the Sithis, comes in. Allows you to keep your hand relatively full. You cast, say a Utopia Sprawl, draw 2 cards. Chances are you're going to find an enchantment. So, basically, this completely neuters creature decks, whether it be Burn, Hammer Time, Living End, even Murktide, all the decks that rely on creatures to kill you. This card, if it resolves, GG, if they have a Presence or a Sithis in play. Your opponent can't touch you. Generally game over, then you just win with a ham sandwich. Then, on top of that, you have March of Otherworldly Light and On Thin Ice as ways to slow down your opponent. March of Otherworldly Light, obviously you can pitch other white spells. Alternatively, you can exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment. There are some things that can disrupt your thing. There are random creatures that blow up enchantments. Most of them don't see play in the main deck, but it is nice to have access to those removal spells. Then On Thin Ice comes in. It's basically like Chain to the Rocks without requiring you to have a mountain. Instead, you have to have a Stoneland, hence why you're seeing the Stoneland mana base out of this deck. And then Emrakul the Aeon's Torn serves a couple functions. It's ultimately your best way to win the game. You don't have to rely on Destiny Spinner or any of the other random attacking dorks you might have access to. And, also makes Mill's life a living nightmare, especially game number 1. There are other win cons that have seen play in the past. There is a variant that was running a 5-mana enchantment that creates angels every time you cast I think Sigil of the Empty Throne or something along those lines, I believe it's called. It's a 5-mana enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell, you put a 4/4 angel in play. But these are kind of what the various versions have been running lately. Sideboard options, Leyline of Sanctity helps to slow down any type of nonsense your opponent's trying to do with discard spells, burn spells, etc. Solidifying those matchups already. Monastery Mentor is an alternative win con with when you're casting spells, you're making a bunch of monks. Generally, your opponent's going to board out a lot of their removal, as there isn't a ton of creatures to target in this deck, so it makes sense to have this kind of juke as a win con. Also, it can help close out the matchup faster against some of the problematic matchups we'll talk about. Rest in Peace, graveyard-based decks, Stony Silence, any type of artifact shenanigans. Hammer Time doesn't completely shut it down, but does help a little bit. Makes equipment obviously impossible to equip unless they have the instant speed equip enchantment out. Seal of Primordium, way to blow up annoying enchantments from your opponent or artifacts. Veil of Summer, help force through your counter spell or your stuff through counter spells. Also decent against discard spells, although you're mainly going to be bringing in against counter spells. And Flame Blitz, ways to deal with annoying planeswalkers. Taking a look at this list, very similar things going on. The other thing I forgot to mention about Sterling Grove. Sterling Grove is a kind of this weird two-part thing. Other enchantments you control Shroud, which means your opponents can't target them. And then, 1, sacrifice Sterling Grove, search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle your library, put that card on top. This gives you ways to find, your Blood Moons, your ways to find your Ghostly Prisons, your copies of Solitary Confinement, etc. Nice way to kind of tie the entire deck together. Ghostly Prison, another card I should mention, makes it more expensive for your opponent to attack you. They have to pay 2 mana for each attacking creature. Oftentimes this buys them enough time to get the engine set up. Hallowed Hunting, as long as there are 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you can create a white spirit token with creature power and toughness to equal the number of spirits you control. This has kind of been the replacement for Throne of the Empty Sigil as an alternative win con. Once again, though, once you kind of establish this lock, you can kind of win with a ham sandwich. Obviously, casting Emrakul with a Sanctum Weaver in play is quite easy. And then, beyond that, you have access to Heliod's Hall of Generosity, which allows you to recur any of these artifacts in your graveyard. So you can even set up a loop where you cast Solitary Confinement, let it die. Or say you add a card, you can let it die, and then, you sacrifice it unless you discard a card. So you can get this loop where you put it back on top of your deck. You don't always have to have that, but you can also rebuy any of your things like Sterling Grove or whatever. And a little bit slow, but it's very similar to Academy Runes, which allows you to recur artifacts, especially in something like Mono Blue Tron. It can be an important piece of the puzzle, but mainly it's just a nice utility land to have access to. Sideboard, you're going to see a lot of the same things. Although, just Flame Blitzes, deals with Planeswalkers, Stony Silence, Rest in Peace, yada yada yada. Destiny Spinner, third or second copy of this one, allows you to fight through counterspells, etc. What's this deck's strengths? What's its weaknesses? Anything creature-based, this deck tends to be pretty good against. While it can have a little bit of trouble with a tempo-based deck like Murktide, sometimes Murktide taking that 1 or 2 turns to set up gives this deck a chance to resolve its key spell, like a Solitary Confinement, sometimes a Blood Moon to mess with Murktide's mana if they're not expecting it out of a deck that's already playing green and white's cards. But, overall, anything that has to deal damage, this deck struggles with. Or they struggle against this deck. Burn, Hammer Time, etc. If they don't kill you quickly, they're in a lot of trouble. Decks that it struggles against, counterspell based decks with with non-creature win cons. So control decks. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, Jace the Mind Sculptor, all these various different planeswalkers. While they don't see a ton of play, this deck doesn't really deal with planeswalkers well, hence why you're seeing the Flame Blitzes in the sideboard. Teferi Hero Time Raveler can mess with your synergies, Run and 6 ultimates. There are all these different things that can really mess with a deck like this, and this deck just doesn't interact with planeswalkers on a profitable manner. So counterspells, planeswalkers, those decks can be difficult, and decks that just don't care what this deck is doing. So win cons like Green Tron is a nightmare matchup for this deck if they don't land a Blood Moon. Just the fact that Karn Liberated and Karn the Great Creator and Ulamog exiling your lands or key different pieces. Tron just can ignore what this deck is doing and go over the top of it. So has some weird matchups. Much like I think the Enchantress deck in Legacy, there are some really, really good matchups, and there are some really bad matchups for this deck. Hence why you're seeing a lot of the things aimed at artifacts, slowing those decks down just enough that the other lock pieces can get into play. You're seeing a lot of Veil of Summer, Destiny Spinner kind of things to be able to resolve your key spells. So, overall, this is an interesting deck, and oh yeah, this is one of the saltiest decks in the format. People don't like losing against this deck. I know even as a burn player, this deck was a nightmare when I'd run against it. Because game one, you kind of have a chance if they don't find a solitary confinement. But, as soon as they establish that lock, you just don't have a prayer. And you have to keep playing the game because there's a chance if they only have one or two draw effects in play that they brick or something. But let's be honest, this deck, once it gets its engine online, is nigh unbeatable without having the perfect hate card at the right time. And it just takes so long to win. They see so many cards. They can just Emrakul, pitch Emrakul, shuffle their library back in, or Hull of Heliod's Generosity, and just never lose the game. It's kind of like these annoying situations. You're just like, no, die already. But, deck has its weaknesses, doesn't see a ton of play, and is actually fairly budget for a modern deck. I was looking at the price online. It's only 100 ticks online, $300 or $400 in paper. So for a modern deck, this is definitely an affordable piece if you're willing to play an unorthodox strategy in the format. But as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know down below what deck you might like to see us cover next in the modern deck guides.